Well, good morning, everyone. Glad that you have joined us here in an effort to keep us on time and to make sure that Reverend Dr. Leah Schade has all of the time that she has prepared for you all today. I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I think if you all are in the right place, if you're not, then I would just encourage you to stay because you'll get a good workshop here. So I'm sure you all read Dr. Shade's bio, but just wanted to do a brief introduction for you all, just in case you didn't take the time to do that. So Reverend Dr. Leah Schade is the Assistant Professor of Preaching and Worship at Lexington Theological Seminary in Lexington, Kentucky. She's an ordained minister in the ELCA and has been for 20 years. She earned both her MDiv and PhD degrees from Lutheran Theological Seminary at Philadelphia, which is now the United Lutheran Seminary. She's done many years in pastoral leadership in congregations in many different contexts, and has written several books, and I'm sure we'll be gleaning from that information this morning as we move through. But her books cover and explore how clergy and churches can address controversial social issues using nonpartisan, biblically centered approaches and deliberative dialogue. She's the director of a Wabash grant exploring the use of deliberative dialogue in congregations and theological education. So welcome, Dr. Schade, and you are now the host and can take over from here.
Thank you, Christy, for that introduction, and it's good to see all of you. And it looks like you're all coming from various places. I thought most people would be in New Mexico, but I'm seeing some people from Texas as well. So that's wonderful. We are a cross-country group here, and I do encourage everyone, if you haven't yet done so, to please put your name and what church you're a member of and where you're located, and that's great. That helps us to get to know each other a little bit. I actually was with some of your group last month. I had done a presentation on environmental issues in the church, and so I'm glad to see some familiar faces from that and some new faces as well. Today I'm going to be talking with you about how we can discover our theologies of conflict. So I'm going to share my screen with you here and take you through a little PowerPoint. And we're going to have some, after I've done some explaining about how to do this, I'm going to give you a chance to actually work with a tool that I've developed on how to discover your congregation's theology of conflict. So as Christy said, I teach at Lexington Theological Seminary here in Kentucky, and we are a seminary that is primarily online. We're an online in-person hybrid. Our students usually only come to us in person during intensives in January and June. But during COVID, we've had to move to a completely online format, and it's working out pretty well overall. But we've got wonderful students here, and I think some of you probably have some of our alums as your pastors and lay leaders as well. I'm actually a Lutheran pastor. I've been ordained since 2000, and I'm very interested in environmental issues in the church. And but a bulk of my work has also been on helping congregations to navigate this very divisive time and figuring out ways to find the purple zone, as I call it, trying to find the sweet spot in the red-blue divide so that we can build up the body of Christ instead of tearing it apart. As Christy mentioned, I am finishing up a grant project called Dialogue in the Purple Zone, Pedagogies for Civil Discourse in Online and On-Site Settings. And this has been funded by the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning and Theology and Religion. And I brought together a team of researchers to work with me to look at ways in which we can equip clergy and laity to do what I call the dialogue sermon method in their congregations in order to address social issues that are affecting God's people. In this grant project, we brought together 10 pastors who were alumni of LTS, and they all serve Disciples of Christ congregations. And we invited each of them to bring a lay leader who was of a different political orientation than they were, so that we wanted to have a good spectrum of political representation in our group. And we gave them training, a 2-day training in the sermon dialogue, sermon method, and did that last September, and then asked them to carry out this process in their congregations over the course of the year. And we just finished up a couple weeks ago and did some follow-up interviews and surveys and that sort of thing. And it's been very interesting because the conflicts that are coming up in the age of COVID and in the midst of Black Lives Matter and in the midst of a very divisive political season are exacerbating some of the conflicts that were existing even before all of these societal pressures. So the goal of the grant was to measure a congregation's capacity for civic engagement and social justice at the conclusion of the grant. One congregation had to drop out because one of their pastors left, but we did have a nice representation in terms of size. So we had one that was rural, 5 in small town, and 3 in suburbs, and they represented the states of Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. The majority of congregants were white, and we also had a wide variety, however, of political representation. These were truly purple churches. So when we talk with the pastors at the end of the grant, we ask them a question. We ask them, what is it like to be a pastor in 2020? And we recorded their answers. And then we did a word cloud based on how many times they said a certain word. And you can see that the main word that comes up is challenging, like all but one. That was the first word out of their mouth. It was just like, whew, so much that they're having to deal with. But also saying that it's been a very exciting time because they're learning to do things that they have been able to expand the church's reach and be able to think about new ways of doing ministry beyond just simply the walls of the congregation. But there has been a lot of anxiety around this, and they are seeing a lot of divisions over, whether to open the church back up again, or, do they wear masks? Do they social distance? All of this, it's putting a lot of pressure on pastors. Now we asked the same question of parishioners, but we asked, so what is it like to be a parishioner in 2020? And here you can see different words that are coming up. A lot of them, you'll see the word like they had to sort of think about this. You see that the 2 biggest words are Zoom and virtual. That is what came up most often, like that has been their experience. Now I'm going to show you a screen that puts these word clouds side by side. And I just want you to take a second to look at these. And then I invite you to just unmute and share, what do you notice about the difference between these word clouds? You don't have to raise your hand because I can't see you anyway because I'm in this mode, but just unmute and just call something out. What do you see here?
Pastors have a lot more going on.
Pastors have a lot more going on. Thank you. What else do you see?
Different words.
A lot of different words, yes. There are a couple of overlaps. You can see the word exciting coming up for both of them. You can see the word like the missing word that's right in the middle of the lay leaders, they're really missing each other and being together. But you're also seeing on the pastor side, the word divisions is pretty strong, and also the word difficult. Good. What else do you see?
Yeah, I see that the lay side is all capitalized and the pastor side is not.
That was just the way the program was. You don't have to read anything into the capitalization.
I don't see on the lay leader side, there are words like reassuring, unifying, and I don't see any of, except for community, there's not a lot of those sorts of comforting words on the pastor side.
That's an astute observation. The more positive words are on the lay leader side, and the more negative words seem to be on the pastor side. And it was very interesting because we did surveys of all the congregations at the end of this, and we asked the congregants, what is your church doing well, and what is your church doing not so well in response to COVID-19? And the overwhelming majority of parishioners is just so appreciative of what their pastors are doing. However, there were some in the surveys who were completely negative and had nothing but bad things to say about their church or their pastor. Like, there's nothing good that my pastor's doing. I'm not satisfied. And so those, even though it's a minority of voices, those are often the ones who will sometimes be the loudest, and the ones who are continually coming at the pastors, asking for changes or things to be done. So the pastors usually hear from that group, and they're not always hearing the positive appreciation from their parishioners. So we really tried to stress this with the pastors, that the majority of your congregants are really very, very happy and blessed by what you're doing.
It makes me wonder, ask the question, did we watch the same movie? Because I get the feeling from this that either the pastors are stressing over things that they don't need to stress over, or the lay leaders are completely oblivious to problems that they maybe need to know about.
That is a really interesting observation. And the researchers and I think that it's a little bit of both. Our sense is that in some ways, as much as pastors try to share the load with their lay leaders, a lot of this is just falling on them. And it's been such a whirlwind that it's been difficult for them to kind of take a breather and just figure out where we go from here. And a lot of lay people are seeing what's happening, and they're seeing the service come together and it looks great. But one of the lay leaders shared that she had gone in to do a recording in the church so that she could do a reading, and she said, I had no idea how much work it is to record a service and put it online. She said, I was clueless. So you're right. A lot of parishioners just don't know what's going on behind the curtain. I'm going to move on here and just note that this is a really contentious time. We've got the red-blue politics. We've got so many issues that are causing divisiveness in our congregations. And it raises the question, does the church speak out about these things? Does the church remain silent? If the church speaks, how do we speak? Do we engage? Do we try to make the church a refuge from having to engage with this? Do we step into the public square and really take up these prophetic issues? There's a lot of variation in both what pastors and congregants say about how the church will respond. And a lot of times it's because people say we cannot discuss politics in church. And when they say the word politics, it usually means something else, like, you're making me uncomfortable, I don't agree with your position, You're crossing the church-state boundary. You're challenging my comfort zone. You're taking sides when I think you should be remaining neutral. You're challenging me and the media that informs my position, and I don't appreciate it. Or I come to church to escape from all of this. I don't want to have to engage this. Some people, it's so complicated. They want an oasis not to have to engage. And for some, it's really painful. You know, they're getting this at work, they're getting this at home. And when they hear it from parishioners as well, fellow parishioners, or from the pastor, it can bring up a lot of emotion with this. So when I look at these reactions, what I see is basically 3 basic categories that we can use to categorize these reactions. Some of them are emotional, some of them have to do with relationships, and some of them have to do with principles. Now, with some of these, there's a combination of 1, 2, or sometimes even all 3 of these. But let's take a look at this list again. And let's see if we can figure out, is the response emotional, relational, or principled? So for example, you're making me uncomfortable. Would that be emotional, relational, or principled? Just call it out.
Emotional.
Emotional.
Yeah, definitely an emotional component there. What about you're crossing church and state boundaries that I think should stay in place?
Principled.
Principle.
Well, principle.
Possibly relational.
Right. So it's a combination of both, but this one is definitely more on the principle side, the principle of the separation of church and state. We're going to talk about what that means in a little bit, but notice that language and how we would categorize that. What about you're taking sides when you should remain neutral?
Relational.
Relational.
And emotional.
Relational and emotional, absolutely. The idea, you know, if they feel that the pastor is in some way judging them or making them feel ashamed about their position, their political position, or things that they need to be working on in their lives or in society, and they feel like they don't measure up. If they feel that the pastor is leaning on one political side or another, that can affect the pastor-parishioner relationship. So here's a distinction that I want to make sure we understand. There's a difference between political and partisan.
Amen.
So there is an ongoing debate about the relationship between government and religion. And the First Amendment was intended to prevent the establishment of a state church. But it did not state that churches could not address issues that involve government. That's a really important thing just to recognize. So it would be inaccurate to accuse a preacher of violating the separation of church and state if they're preaching about a contemporary issue of public concern, as long as they're not saying, well, you need to vote for this person or not vote for this person. As long as they're not engaging in partisan politics, but focusing on biblical and theological ideas, rooting in those, then that's actually okay. And if you look at scripture, you can see that that people in the Bible, including Jesus, were often engaging in the contemporary issues of their time. Everything from taxes, you know, render under Caesar what is Caesar's, render under God what is God, to access to healthcare, you know, who's touching the robe, who's being let down through the roof to get healing from Jesus, to distribution of resources, you know, the feeding of the 5,000.
How old do you think that man was in the truck?
So when we talk about politics,
Oh yeah, sorry.
one of the things we want to recognize is that the root of the word politics is polis, which means citizenry and community. So the basic political question is, what kind of community shall we be? And the process by which we answer this is politics. So when people say, "Oh, I don't like politics in the church," or "Oh, I don't like to talk about politics," that's true because it's messy and it's complicated. And sometimes it feels like there's this tug and pull, and people's needs are not always being recognized or met. But one of the things we want to recognize is that the church has a role in this, because the church has been given a responsibility by Jesus to make sure that the people of God are paid attention to, taken care of, that the least of these are being lifted up, and that we are building the realm of God, the beloved community. So the question arises, what is just? What is fair in this situation and at this time? And in the Bible, we see that justice means care for the neighbor. How do we care for those, the least of these, those who are in need? How do we respect each other? How do we engage when we have different ideas about how things should be done? So the thing is, it's not that the church or the Christians have, some kind of revelation about what we should do. It doesn't mean that we want to live in a theocracy, that the church takes over. But because the church lives by hope and lives by and is informed by these moral and ethical principles, we have something to say. We have perspective. And if we believe in a risen Christ, then we're being called into a future that he has inaugurated and that we want to be a part of. So that leaves the question, well, what are we going to do? What kind of community will we be? Yes, the answer is complex, and it's going to require public discourse. It means we're going to have to talk to each other. It means that we have to discern, we have to be in dialogue. And for pastors, it means that there needs to be a certain amount of prophetic preaching so that we can address these issues. But here's the thing. The ability of a congregation to have these conversations and to be resilient in the midst of difficulties is directly tied to its relationship with conflict. That means their past history with conflict and controversy, their capacity for tolerating the initial discomfort that comes up when we talk about the opioid crisis or racial justice or climate change. And it has to do with a congregation's theology of conflict. Now, what do I mean by that? What is a theology of conflict? Very basically, a theology of conflict is what we believe about the relationship between God and human conflict. This idea it hasn't been fully developed in a lot of church literature. We have a lot of tools to help us manage conflict once it's erupted in a congregation, and we have best practices to mitigate the conflict, but we don't always think about what's our theology. Two resources and two people that I've drawn on from this are Ellen Ott Marshall, who wrote a book called Christians in the Public Square, Faith That Transforms Politics. And my colleague in the Academy of Homiletics, Amy Moiso, just finished her dissertation, and she presented a paper called Standing in the Breach, Conflict Transformation and the Practice of Preaching. And as I was reading their work and thinking about my own work with pastors and congregations, I realized that having some understanding of our own and our congregation's theologies of conflict is important because it has explicit and implicit implications for dialogue. So, for example, if we assume that God does not approve of conflict, if we think that God is angry when we have some kind of human conflict, then we may be hesitant to engage in any kind of controversy. We may worry that we're going to disappoint God or that we'll go against God's will if we grapple with some of these complex issues. On the other hand, if we believe that God works in and through human conflict in order for God's will to be done, then we may be more willing to enter into dialogue about a difficult issue. So what I'm going to do in just a minute here is I'm going to share with you something I call discovering our theologies of conflict. And I'm going to split you into groups and have you work with that. While I am doing that, I want to just take about 5 minutes and let you ask some questions about this before we move into small groups. If you have a question, again, I can't see everybody, so just unmute and we'll try to take them one at a time. Any questions?
Yes. I have been in situations, as I think all of us have, where some of us are prepared to talk to and talk with and have conversation around an issue, and other people are saying, no, if I don't see it, it doesn't exist. So how do you get on the same page with folks that have a different theology of conflict than you do?
That's a great question, Janine. One of the things that we have to realize is that people have differing bandwidths for how much conflict and controversy they can deal with. So if you're involved in a very stressful job, if things are stressful at home, if things are stressful in the church, then your Lisa Cressman, who wrote a book called Preaching the Gospel God that we don't want to hear, she talked about brittle congregations that don't have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to difficult issues, because they've been through conflict before. They know what it can do to a congregation, and there are some that are like, I just can't go there. And like, see no conflict, hear no conflict, talk about no conflict. The difficulty, however, is that if we don't have a conversation about how we deal with conflict in a healthy way, it's going to come out no matter what. And it could come out in a very unhealthy way. It can come out in terms of, the parking lot conversations, right? You know about those. It can come out in the email chain that goes outside of the pastor's email,
Preach,
but is
preach.
Yeah. So it can come out in even like really dysfunctional ways, like anonymous notes slid under the pastor's door, or or direct pushback against the pastor. And sometimes pastors are like, it's like being in an open field in a lightning storm holding a book with a metal rod hidden inside, right? We become the target for a lot of this energy just by virtue of our position. So we have to figure out, how do we ground ourselves, and so that it doesn't like blow us apart, but at the same time, how can we use that energy in a productive way? Because that's what it is. It's energy. If we didn't care about this stuff, it wouldn't be an issue, but we care. It's affecting our lives. It's affecting our communities. So we want to think about, especially in a time when we're not in conflict, let's use a tool like this. And you'll see in the chat, I have it's a PDF. It's called Theologies of Conflict Discussion Questions. I'm going to ask you all to open that up on your computer, because then I'm going to split you into groups so that you can discuss this. Now, what I'm going to do before that, I just want to show you a little bit about what you're going to see when you open up that document. So this is going to help you think about the different approaches that people have when it comes to conflict. Now, this is a tool that you can use with your governing board, with your board of elders. It can be used with your leadership, like the leaders of your small groups or your committees. And you'll see that there are 11 questions. And what I want you to do when you get into your small groups, and you're going to get 15 minutes to do this, and then we're going to bring you back and hear what it was like for you. I want you to just work with questions 1 and 2, and then go down and deal with questions 10 and 11. You may not have time to get to all of them. That's okay. But you'll see there are many more questions. And what I recommend is that a board could take one question a month and work through these over the course of a year so that conversations about conflict become normalized. So we're not so afraid of it, but it becomes part of, okay, who are we? Who is God? How are we in relationship with each other? How is God in relationship with us? And we, in a sense, inoculate ourselves, right? We give ourselves a little conflict vaccine, and we work with it in small doses so that if something does come up, we have the capacity to absorb that and deal with it in a healthy way. So again, you're working with questions 1, 2, 10, and 11. If you get through all of them and you want to do one of the other ones, that's perfectly fine. But that's what I want you to work with for the next 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do here is I am going to divide you into breakout rooms. And gosh, we have 38 people here. Oh, that's wonderful. All right, so I'm going to break it so that you have about 5 to 6 people per room. And once you go into you'll have to accept going into the room. You'll make sure you get that, make sure you download that before you go into your room. And then I will give you a minute warning before I bring you back. And then we're going to talk about, what did you talk about? Okay, everybody ready? Thumbs up. It's going to be like Harry Potter. You're going to be whooshed into another room. Here we go. Welcome back. It's like magic, isn't it? Okay, so what did you learn? What did you talk about? And yes, you do absolutely have permission to use this with your congregations. That's why I gave it to you. That is yours to use, make copies of, however it can be helpful to you. As it says on the sheet, this is something that you can use not only with your governing boards, but you can use this with youth groups. You can use this with other pastors. Use this however it would be helpful to you.
Hey, Leah, can I point in a piece of information here?
Absolutely.
A few that were in my breakout group didn't get a chance to get it downloaded. So just if you weren't able to, I've downloaded it and it will go out in the post-assembly emails that you will all receive. So if you didn't get the document, don't worry about it. You will get it later.
And I will also put it in the chat here again for you. So, so you'll all have that. So there it is. Okay, so just go ahead and unmute and tell me what you talked about. What was an insight? Go ahead,
I go
Janine.
first. My group, okay. We discussed a lot on the first one. We spent most of our time in the first, and we decided that it was mostly about disagreement. A few of us were feeling the anger and the tension that it brought, but most of us felt the disagreement. Interesting takes on the Bible. We brought up Job, does God use conflict? We brought up Job. And then I say we, I'm not going to name names. Somebody in our group also brought up from the New Testament the conflict concept of turn the other cheek. And if you're asked to walk 1 mile, you should walk 2. And where's that enter into conflict? And then we talked about Paul and the council in Jerusalem about, circumcision, and also about the creation of the need for elders and deacons, because some of the widows and orphans were not getting as much as others of the widows and orphans. And so I can't even imagine, I'm hungry and I'm looking at you and you got all kinds of food there. And why? Because I speak a different language? What? And then about God revealing himself in human conflict. And it was, yeah, pretty much, and that's kind of as far as we got, because we spent a lot of time in the first one.
Well, that's great, Janine. Thank you. One of the things that it's really an interesting subject to discuss with parishioners is where do we see conflict in Scripture? Sometimes people think that, when they don't really get into the Bible in a very deep way, that it's mostly about, love and forgiveness and all that sort of thing. It is, but it's also a book about people being in conflict with each other from almost the very beginning, right? And how does God interact with people? There is no one way, because it's so varied. There are different circumstances. There are different power differentials. And we can see that sometimes the Bible is prescriptive, like here's how you should handle it. When Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew says, look, if you have a conflict with somebody, you do it one-on-one. If you can't work it out, you bring in a neutral third party and you try to work it out that way. If that still doesn't work, then you take it to your governing board and you try to work it out that way. So there's that. So that's prescriptive. But sometimes the Bible is descriptive. It's showing us what can happen in human conflict when in the worst possible scenarios. Wars break out, people are killed, the vulnerable are oppressed. So just having those conversations, and again, rooting this in Scripture, is really helpful. Okay, what did others discuss in their groups?
We discussed the importance of respect, and that will either cause a flare-up in conflict or will have meaningful dialogue, depending on your respect.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Frank. And one of the things that churches can actually teach their young people and adults is, how do we respect each other? We are unfortunately in an age where we don't see a lot of civil behavior modeled for us, especially in social media. We don't see it modeled for us in in movies or TV, or you know, it's hard to come across. So one role of the church can be simply to help people recognize what is within the bounds of respectful behavior and what is not. And I know that should be something that we just instinctively know, and it's a shame that we've gotten to this point, but that's the way it is. And so the church has great resources for this. We've got 10 commandments. We've got instructions. We've got Jesus giving us really good models for this. So you're absolutely right, Frank. Learning how to respect, and the tangible, concrete ways that we can practice respect is really important. Thanks for that, Frank. Others?
One person in our group used the term of conflict, particularly the kind of, this was in a discussion of a congregation where there's long-term simmering conflict. Someone used the term as abstract violence.
Ooh.
And a number of us, I think, are finding that to be an intriguing phrase just to wrestle with and see what that reveals.
Okay, whoever said that, that is a really cool term. If you came up with it yourself, like, trademark that, because that's really good. And if it came from something else, I'd love to, if you want to put it in the chat where you got that from, I'd love to hear that. So abstract violence, that's really interesting, because it reminds me a little bit of the term microaggressions. You know, the little ways in which we slight somebody, snipe at somebody, the attitudes that we get, you know, the colloquial term, sometimes the kids call it throwing shade at people. There are ways that we can damage somebody, not always with physical violence, although that also happens. But you're right, this abstract violence is that happens very often. And part of why that is, in my observations, is that we lose the capacity for empathy. We've lost the capacity to understand how it feels for another to hurt. So this can be another role for the church and for preachers, to develop the capacity for deep feeling and compassion and empathy, feeling with, feeling for. That, you know, when Jesus says to love your neighbor as you love yourself, to understand where are those pain points, and how can we treat each other in a way that we're not pressing on those pain points, but we are in fact trying to handle with care. Somebody described to me one time that when we're dealing with some of these complex social issues, it's like if you've got a tooth that needs some work done. If it's been simmering in there for a long time, as you had said, William, like kind of underneath the surface, even if you just touch it slightly, there's going to be a reaction, right? So you have to do some anesthetizing so that you can work in there and get at the infection underneath and try to remedy that. Okay, so Kay, I don't see your last name. She says, I confess abstract violence was my term. I thought of the term out some very difficult experiences with conflict in my church. Okay, Kay, that is awesome. We all are like gold star for you. And I will be sure to give you credit for that, Kay. And if you wouldn't mind putting your last name in there, I want to make sure that I reference that, because that's abstract violence. Wow, that's powerful. Judith, I see your hand.
Thank you. In our group, we were expressing the importance of listening and to each other and honoring and respecting. But then we summed it up at the end. It said the goal is love of God and love of each other. That's our underlying goal.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Judith. One of the ways that I have worked with to help people develop those listening skills is through a method of civil discourse called deliberative dialogue, and it was developed by the Kettering Foundation. And in this method, you bring together people from different constituencies and different political viewpoints, different races, ages, ethnicities, that sort of thing. And you're talking about an issue, but before you get into it, you establish some ground rules for how we talk to each other. And then people share how the issue has affected them or their families. So the sharing of stories is one way that we can develop empathy. You know, we can disagree about principles, we can disagree about intellectual ideas, but somebody's experience is their experience. And learning how to create a holding space for that within the church is one of the most profound things that we can do to communicate that love of neighbor and love of God. So that's beautiful. Thank you, Judith. We have a couple minutes left. We can probably take one or two more comments. Werner?
The idea of, or the concept of Imago Dei, all of us being made in the image of God and being children of God, can be very anchoring in when engaging with someone that has a much different viewpoint, to remember that that person whose viewpoint that may conflict with ours is just as much a child of God as we are.
That's beautiful. And again, that's why thinking about the theology behind this is so important. One of the things that I've found is when people use this this worksheet, with these questions, is that they have some assumptions about God and conflict that are underneath the surface, but they haven't really articulated before. And so being able to voice that helps people to see that Imago Dei, you know, that is within all of us. And it also, you know, one time I did this with, it was in a gathering of Lutherans, and I had them sit according to their groups at different tables. So this church was here, this church was there, this church was there. And then they did this, and at the end, one of them, and it was their council members, and their pastor was at the table, and they said, well, you know, one of the most important things we learned from this is that we just don't talk about theology enough. Like, there's a question on there about, you know, what do we think about conflict in the theology, or Trinitarian theology? And they're like, Pastor, we never talk about Trinitarian theology. Why do we not talk about Trinitarian theology? And he's like, yeah, I guess probably we should do that. So it just shows that people are hungry for these conversations. You know, that sometimes I don't think we give people credit for the desire to have these in a respectful and courageous way that respects that Imago Dei and allows that to shine forth in the midst of all of the messiness. Chuck Kutzmarks put a link into the chat for the Dialogue Institute. I appreciate that. I'm sure that has some really great resources as well. So I encourage you all to click that open and save that for yourselves as well. We have come to the end of our time, but I have really appreciated your willingness to engage this topic. And if you have other questions that you would like to ask me, I will put my email address here into the chat. And I will also put into the chat the link to the book, Preaching in the Purple Zone, so that if you want to check that out and maybe work through that with your pastor, and or with your congregation. It's not just for pastors. It's something that can be done with congregation members, and there's a lot of good resources for thinking through things like this theology of conflict and the dialogues that we can have with each other to help us to truly be the church in the midst of this difficult time, and to see this as an opportunity to help build the realm of God and to express that love of God and love of neighbor. So thank you, everyone, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your conference together.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.